بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه ما بعد. Jamaat al-Muslimin, respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum jami'an. Aynama kuntum. Welcome to each and every single one of you, wherever you might be. This is our program, Palestine, the Holy Land. And we are going to continue with our discussion about the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt in Palestine. I'm going to continue from where I left off, speaking about some of the causes that led to the outbreak of the Arab revolt in 1936. We were taking some statistics from the book of Ghassan Kanafani. Ghassan Kanafani was in fact born in 1936 in Akka, and he was, along with his family, he was ethnically cleansed from the city of Akka in 1948 in the great catastrophe in the Nakba. So in this book of his, he's basically just putting forward some statistics about the Zionist immigration that was taking place, that was causing great fear and resentment within the Arab population, within the Palestinian Arab population. And especially considering the fact that this European Jewish capital, this Zionist capital that was being brought in, was now dominating the process of industrialization. So it was affecting workers in the cities, and it was affecting, with the land sales, it was affecting the peasant farmers in the rural areas. And of course, the slogan of Hisdarot, the Jewish labor only, this was to have grave consequences. And I think the last thing that we spoke about in the previous halaqah is that it led to the rapid emergence of fascist patterns in the society of the Zionist settlers. Something that Asher Ginsberg, Ahad Aham, had warned about in his article that he wrote in 1891 about the fact that the Zionists were slaves in exile. They were being persecuted in Europe, and now that they came to the land of Palestine, they had become despots in the way that they were. And this is a Zionist himself. He's the father of cultural Zionism, Ahad Aham. Asher Ginsberg. Ahad Aham, Ahadul Awam, as we say in Arabic, one of the people, that was his nickname. But he pointed out very early on that the Zionists were mistreating. Which is very sad, because in Europe, they as so-called Jews were being mistreated in Europe. And now they came to Palestine, and now they were mistreating the indigenous people of Palestine. And he rebuked them for that. And at the end, he says, you were slaves in the land of exile, and now that you have come to Palestine, you have become despotic, which very often happens when a slave becomes a king. Those are the words of Ahad Aham, of Asher Ginsberg. Another result, we're going to continue with our article from Ghassan Kanafani. He says another result was the development of a competitive struggle between the Palestinian Arab and Jewish proletariats. A proletariat is, in fact, it's a Latin term that is used for working class people, and especially in the Marxist ideology or the Marxist terminology. And Ghassan Kanafani was actually of that mindset. So you'll see him using words like proletariat and bourgeoisie, etc., etc. He says another result was the development of a competitive struggle between the Palestinian Arab and Jewish working class, and between Palestinian Arab peasants, farmers, and agricultural laborers, and their Jewish counterparts. Because remember, in the so-called first Aliyot, 1881 to 1904, Palestinians were still working in the Zionist agricultural settlements. They had been living in those lands for generations. So when the absentee landlords, especially in Syria and Lebanon, when they sold these tracts of land to the Zionists still allowed the Palestinians to continue to work their land because, quite frankly, they didn't know how to work the land. They had come from Europe. They weren't involved in much farming in Europe, if at all. And so they had to basically learn from the Palestinians. And the Palestinians were the first ones to work their agricultural settlements. But then with the advent of Hisdarot, the so-called Jewish labor only, or Hebrew labor, that came with the advent of labor Zionism, socialist Zionism, the Palestinians were no longer allowed to work on the Jewish Zionist settlements. Forgive me for coupling those words together, but these are Jews that had embraced Zionism. We can again go down the road of debating the difference, which I consider to be vast, between Judaism and Zionism. But in the words of Nachman Sirkin, they had invented a new Judaism, the Zionists. And he said, this Zionist Judaism uproots religious Judaism in a stronger way than reform and assimilation. He says it stands in total contrast to the Judaism of exile. And that is the father of socialist Zionism himself, Nachman Sirkin. So there is a competitive struggle between the working class, the workers in the cities, vying for the jobs, because now the Jewish capital is giving the Zionists, the European Jewish capital, is giving the Zionists the upper hand in the industrialization process. They are dominating industry, and they are giving jobs to these new immigrants that are coming, these Zionist immigrants that are coming from Europe. So there was a competitive struggle, and there was a competitive struggle between the Palestinian Arab peasants, the farming peasants, and the and agricultural laborers, and their Jewish counterparts who were getting all the jobs on the land that was now being, although it was, by 1948, I've said this many times, I'll repeat it again, they had only purchased 6.6% of the land. Out of the 28 or 29 million dunams, they were only controlling, or they had only purchased 6.6% of the land. This conflict also extended to higher classes, inasmuch as the Palestinian Arab small landowners and urban middle class, he says middle bourgeoisie, realized that their interests were being threatened by growing Jewish capital. In 1935, for example, Jews controlled 872 of a total of 1,212 industrial firms in Palestine, employing 13,678 workers, while the rest were Palestinian Arab controlled and employed about 4,000 workers. Remember, they're coming out of the 1800s. They are in the early, or at least in the first quarter of, or the first third of the 1900s, of the 20th century. This is the Industrial Revolution, which in the Ottoman time, had not yet arrived in Palestine. So that capital that the Zionist Jews brought with them was the main, cause that gave them this dominance in the industrialization of Palestine, but at the same time, it marginalized the Palestinian workers. Look, of course, during the Mandate, the industrialization process was going on under the British. But because of the fact that the first High Commissioner was a committed Zionist, he was basically opening all the doors for the Zionists to attain that dominance in industry, which they did. So, Jewish investment, Zionist investment, I prefer to say, totaled 4,391,000 Palestinian lira, compared to 704,000 Palestinian lira in the Palestinian Arab industrial investment. Zionist production reached 6 million Palestinian lira compared to 1.545 or 1,545,000 by Palestinian Arab firms. In addition, Zionist capital controlled 90% of the concessions. There we go. You see? Under the British administration, you've got the likes of Herbert Samuel, committed Zionist, as the first High Commissioner. And we're not going to get into the details of all the commissioners and how much they either helped or favored the Zionist project, but most certainly right throughout the entire mandate, up until at least until the White Paper, when the British administration, because of the outbreak of or the world on the brink of another world war, World War II, and they didn't want a rebellion of Arabs and Muslims in the British Empire in general. And so the White Paper in 1939 basically upset the Zionists and basically put the Zionist project from the Zionist point of view in danger. And that's why you had these Zionist militias like the Haganah and then Irgun, which broke away from the Haganah, and then the Stern Gang or the Lehi, which broke away from the Irgun. Started their terrorist campaign against the British administration, blowing up the King David Hotel, assassinating Lord Moyne and Count Bernadotte, and hanging British policemen in trees, and all sorts of acts of terror they committed against the British. But that's only after the White Paper. The White Paper, which said that 75,000 immigrants over 5 years, Zionist immigrants over 5 years, and then after that it'll have to be with the consent of the Arabs, and there would be a restriction on land sales as well. That was the White Paper, which was issued under the auspices or the leadership of the Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald in 1939. That's after the conference at St. James Palace in 1938. Very interesting read, that particular, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So the Zionist capital controlled 90% of the concessions granted by the British mandatory government. They were giving them all the concessions. 90% of the concessions went to the Zionists. And this is all because of the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. This was the whole vision. That is why even when David Lloyd George, when he had his secret interview in the, was it the Palin Commission? Or we can come back to that. But basically what happened was, when the Arab revolt broke out, there was a commission, another investigation into the causes of the Arab revolt, and there was the consideration at that time, 1937, that for the first time they suggested the partitioning of Palestine, which of course the Arabs rejected, because even that 20% that was going to be given to the Zionists, they had already said that if we're going to get this 20%, then we wanted to be free of Palestinians. They wanted to transfer the Palestinians out. They would have ethnically cleansed that 20%. Well, they ended up ethnically cleansing 78% of the country in 1948. David Ben-Gurion wrote to his son Amos and said, well, this is just a stepping stone. We will take the 20% and then we'll eventually we'll take over the whole country. But what is important to note is that right throughout the mandate, there were, well, at least up until the white paper, so from 1917 to 1939, the idea was that they must make in Palestine a majority so-called Zionist Jewish population. And that's why even David Lloyd George was, in his secret interview, was dead set against the partition, because he felt that Palestine must be kept as a whole, and the Zionist Jews must be made a majority in the land. That was the goal of the British administration from 1917 well, this is what they were helping the Zionists do. This is what they were facilitating for the Zionists. This was the whole vision of Herbert Samuel in his Future of Palestine memorandum in 1915. And this is basically what the promise was, although it was reinterpreted by the British administration for their geopolitical interests just before the outbreak of the Second World War. But up until that time, the interpretation had been mass immigration, unrestricted land sales, so that the Zionists could become the majority in the land. So this is why we see Jewish capital, Zionist capital, controlling 90% of the concessions granted by the British administration, which accounted for a total investment of 5,789,000 Palestinian lira and provided labor for 2,619 workers. An official census, it says here, in 1937 indicated that an average Jewish worker received 145% more in wages than his Palestinian Arab counterpart. That's 1.5 times more. 1.5 times more. So if the Zionist worker is getting 150 Rand a month, the Palestinian Arab is only getting 50 Rand a month. Now, 1.5 times 125 Rand. 125 Rand and 50 Rand. 1.5 times more. So, now, as high as 433% more in textile factories. 4.5 times more in textile factories, employing Jewish and Arab women, and 233 times in tobacco factories. It sounds like apartheid South Africa, doesn't it? By July 1937, the real wages of the average Palestinian Arab worker decreased 10%, while those of a Jewish worker rose 10%. So wages for Arabs were getting less, and wages for Zionist Jews were getting more. The situation resulted in an almost total collapse of the Arab economy in Palestine, primarily affecting Palestinian Arab workers. In this report to the Palin Commission was after the Nabi Musa rights. The Peel Commission. I knew it was with a P. Forgive me, there's so many names of people and places and commissions that one has to remember. Yes, we said there was the Peel Commission, and there was the Shaw Commission, and the Haycraft Commission, and the Murison Commission. But 1937 was the Peel Commission. Lord Peel was the one who oversaw that commission, and it was in that commission, there was many interviews that were done under that commission in Palestine as well as in England. And David Lloyd George, in fact, I spoke about that that secret interview of David Lloyd George, where he was dead set against the partition of Palestine, not because the Arabs didn't want it, no, but because he wanted to see the end goal of the Zionists to become a majority, an absolute majority in the land of Palestine. And that's why he was against restricting immigration and land sales, as well as the partition of the land. I want to go back to that interview, but we'll speak about that when we get to the when we get to the Peel Commission, which happens during the Arab Revolt. During the Peel Commission, that was basically like a cessation of hostilities, and then after the commission, the hostilities continued. In his report to the Peel Commission, George Mansour, the Secretary of the Federation of Palestinian Arab Workers in Jaffa, indicated that 98% of Palestinian Arab workers had a well below average standard of living. Based on a census covering 1,000 workers in Jaffa in 1936, the Federation had found that the income of 50% of Arab workers was less than 2,750 Palestinian lira. The average minimum income required to support a family being the average minimum income required to support a family being 12% less than 4,250 Palestinian lira, 12% less than, just too many numbers here. So, when the mandatory government refused to allow nearly 1,000 unemployed Jaffa workers to hold a demonstration on the 6th of June 1935. So the bottom line of that previous statement is too many numbers and percentages here, but that 50% of Arab workers were earning less than what was required to support their families. Almost 60%. Almost 60% did not have enough money to pay for the basic essentials of life. And then on top of that, the mandatory government refused to allow them to hold a demonstration on the 6th of June 1935. The Federation of Workers issued a statement warning the government that unless their problems were solved, the government would soon have to give the workers either bread or bullets. So, it was a desperate situation. These things don't just happen in a vacuum. With the conditions of workers continuing to deteriorate, an uprising seemed imminent. George Mansour came out with striking illustrations in his report to the Peel Commission. By the end of 1935, 2,220 men and women workers were unemployed in the city of Jaffa alone, with a population of 71,000. Mansour pointed out 5 reasons for the high unemployment rate, 4 of which were directly connected with Zionist immigration. Number 1, the settling of new immigrants. 2, urban migration. 3, dismissal of Arab workers from their jobs. 4, the deteriorating economic situation. 5, the discriminatory policy of the mandatory government in favor of Zionist workers. Pure, unadulterated apartheid. Let us take a short break. We'll be back thereafter bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala ma ba'd. Jamaatul Muslimin, respected viewers, once again, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our program, Palestine, the Holy Land. And trouble is brewing in Palestine. We are speaking in the past. It could be considered trouble then. It's a genocide now. But these were the seeds that produced the evil fruit of the Zionist entity taking over in 1948, ethnically cleansing 750,000 Palestinians, destroying 531 villages, another 350,000 in 67. And now we see, not too long ago, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, another war criminal, initiating the annexation of the West Bank. And what we see in Gaza, everything totally destroyed, reduced to rubble, and an active genocide in front of our eyes, being broadcast, live stream in 4K, starving people, being murdered, waiting in lines for a little bit of food just to stay alive. Something in excess of, over the last few weeks, 400 people have been killed. I think it's a week or 2 weeks, I'm not exactly sure, but this morning I read 400 people have been killed waiting in lines, starving people waiting in lines for food. What we are speaking about are the seeds that produce this evil fruit of Zionism in the land, of Zionist occupation and domination and brutalization and genocide that we are seeing today. These are the seeds that we are speaking about. So coming back to Ghassan Kanafani, he says, in a period of 9 months, the number of Histarut workers increased by 41,000. Histarut being the Jewish-only labor. So if it's Histarut, that means Palestinians have lost their jobs. According to an article published in issue number 3,460 of the newspaper Davar, Histarut workers numbered 115,000 at the end of July 1931. The official 1936 government report had showed their number at the end of 1935 to be 74,000. So you can see a drastic increase year on year. The policy of dismissal of Palestinian Arab workers from firms and projects controlled by Zionist capital initiated violent clashes. In the 4 Jewish settlements of Malbis, Dayran, Wadi Hunayn and Kadira, there were 6,214 Palestinian Arab workers in February of 1935. After 6 months, this figure decreased to 2,276. So, I mean, almost 2/3 of those Palestinian Arab workers were dismissed. And in a year's time, it went down to 617. Or 10%. 90% of those jobs were totally decimated for the Palestinian Arabs. And given to what? To Jewish-only labor. Attacks against Palestinian Arab workers also took place. On one occasion, for instance, the Zionist community forced a Palestinian Arab contractor and his workers to leave their work in the Brodsky building in Haifa. Among those who were systematically losing their jobs were workers in orchards, cigarette factories, masons' yards, construction, etc., etc. You know, it's so easy just to say, okay, the Balfour Declaration was issued, and you know, it's 1917 and 1920 there were riots, you know, and some Jews and Arabs got killed, and 1929 the Western Wall riots, the Hayat al-Barak riots. And of course, 1921, the Jaffa riots, 1929, Hayat al-Barak riots, you know, and then 1936, a complete revolt. Without speaking about what was happening. Their country was being stolen in front of their eyes, and there was nothing that they could do about it, how can I say, peacefully. They tried. They petitioned the British administration. You know, how many commissions were there before the Arab Revolt? The Palin Commission, the Shaw Commission, the Haycraft Commission, the Murison Commission. And every time they're saying, please stop the immigrations, stop the land sales. And while the immigration is coming in, while the Zionist capital is coming in, while the Zionists are now dominating the industry, Palestinians are losing their livelihood. They can't look after their families. And even those who have got jobs are earning below the minimum wage of what it requires to look after a family. So these kinds of things don't happen in a vacuum. All right, so between 1930 and 1935, Palestinian Arab pearl industry exports fell from 11,532 Palestinian lira to 3,777 Palestinian lira a year. The number of Palestinian Arab soap factories fell from 12 in 1929 to 4 in 1935. The export value also fell. It was clear that the Arab working class had fallen victim to British colonialism and Zionist capital. and in this case, it was Zionist capital that was funding this Zionist project that was being overseen and facilitated by the British administration. Unhindered, unrestricted, until the end of the Arab revolt. So that's something to think about. Yehuda Bauer wrote, on the eve of the 1936 disturbances, Palestine was possibly the only country in the world, apart from the USSR, that had not been affected by the world economic crisis. In America, you had the Great Depression. And right throughout Europe, they were affected. He said, in fact, it enjoyed real prosperity as a result of a massive import of capital. Over, listen here, 30 million. Over 30 million in capital had entered Palestine. The imported capital had even fallen short of the necessary funds needed for all the investment programs. This prosperity, however, was based on rather shaky foundations, which collapsed once the influx of private capital came to an end because of the fears of the outbreak of war in the Mediterranean, the Second World War. The loan system collapsed. This is Yehuda Bauer speaking here. He said the loan system collapsed and there were indications of serious unemployment and construction activity greatly diminished. Palestinian Arab workers were being dismissed by both Arab and Jewish employers, a number of them returning to their original villages. National consciousness was rising due to the aggravating economic crisis. Kanafani says here, Bauer, however, amidst the primary factor, continued Jewish immigration. Sir John Hope Simpson, remember the Hope Simpson report that eventually became the Parsfield, or basically translated into the Parsfield paper that wanted to restrict immigration and land sales? John Hope Simpson stated in his report that it was a bad and perhaps a dangerous policy to allow large sums of money to be invested in unprofitable industries in Palestine to justify increased immigration. I think in one of the commissions, the report or the paper that was produced thereafter said that immigration should only be restricted based on economic absorptive capacity. So they were just, the Zionist organization was just collecting money all over the world and sending it to Palestine to justify, even into industries that were not profitable, just to justify more immigration. Absolute majority or absolute existence? Remember Jabotinsky? Now this was the idea. They either must become an absolute majority or they must have an absolute existence, meaning they must transfer all the Palestinians out of Palestine. I mean, here they were just, they were using money and power. The money was coming from the Zionists, and the power was in the hands of the British administration, who was helping facilitate the Zionist project. So so it was a gradual. At this stage, it was gradual. With the Nakba, and that's why it's called the Great Catastrophe, a Nakba. These were all catastrophes that were already happening. These were all Nakabat. But we could say a Nakba al-Kubra for the time was 48. When everything that they had been building up in terms of undermining and discriminating and marginalizing, and then of course with the Arab revolt breaking the back, the British administration broke the back of the Palestinian resistance. And so 1948, it was, the Palestinians were fair game. The leadership was in exile. They had no arms. And the untrained, small numbers of undisciplined regiments that were sent by various Arab countries, I mean, even in terms of the numbers, the Zionist army, which was armed to the teeth, especially by the Czechoslovakians, and also the arms that was shipped over from America in parts, even though there was an arms embargo, but they managed to get the arms through and assemble it in Palestine. The Palestinians didn't have a chance. He didn't have a chance. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin tells us when he was in his village in Jura, in Asqalan, that when the Egyptians came there, the first thing they did was to disarm the Palestinians. And then when they were retreated back to Egypt, which was still basically under the control of the British, there was just a puppet king, in place. The Egyptian officers' revolution hadn't yet taken place. It took place in the 50s. That when they got the order to retreat, they took the arms of the Palestinians with them. And when the Zionists came, the Palestinians had nothing to defend themselves against the ethnic cleansing of 1948. So, John Hope Simpson, what does he state? It was a bad and perhaps a dangerous policy to allow large sums of money to be invested in unprofitable industries in Palestine to justify increased immigration. Economic absorptive capacity, that's what they called it. In effect, Bauer's statement was basically unfounded, since the influx of Jewish capital continued during the years he referred to and, in fact, reached its climax in 1935. The number of immigrants also increased during these years. Moreover, the dismissal of Arab workers by Jewish employers had begun long before that time. In the meantime, large masses of Palestinian Arab peasants were being evicted. Remember Jezreel Valley, Marj ibn Amir, thousands of Palestinian families were evicted. So large masses of Palestinian Arab peasants were being evicted and uprooted from their lands as a result of Jewish or Zionist colonization of rural areas. They immigrated to cities and towns only to face increasing unemployment. The Zionist machine took full advantage of the rivalry between Palestinian Arab workers and their fellow Zionist Jewish workers. Israeli leftists later observed that not once in a period of 50 years were Jewish workers mobilized and rallied around material issues of struggle, or around material issues or the struggle of labor federation to challenge the Israeli regime itself. The Jewish proletariat could not be mobilized around its own cause. The fact is that the situation was fully the result of efficient Zionist planning. To recall Herzl's words, private land in areas, this is now Theodor Herzl. In fact, let us get the exact place where this is Theodor Herzl's Selected Works, Newman edition. So Theodor Herzl, the father of political Zionism, he says, private land in areas located to us must be seized from its owners. Poor inhabitants are to be quickly evacuated across the border after having secured for them jobs in the countries of their destination. They are to be denied employment. In fact, this is that same quote that I always quote from his, I don't know if it's the exact quote, but a very similar quote from his diary of 1895, that the penniless poor must be spirited across the border. He says, evacuated. Here he says, evacuated across the border after having secured for them jobs in countries of their destination. So get for them jobs in Jordan, get for them jobs in Egypt, get for them jobs in Iraq, but in Palestine they're not going to stay. That has been the goal of the Zionists from the beginning. They are to be denied employment in our country, he says. As for large property owners, they will ultimately join us. The Histadrut summed up its policy by declaring that to allow Arabs to penetrate the Jewish labor market meant that the influx of Jewish capital would be employed to service Arab development, which is contrary to Zionist objectives. Furthermore, the employment of Arabs in Jewish industries would lead to a class division in Palestine along racial lines. Capitalist Jews enjoying or employing Arab workers, should this be permitted, we would have introduced into Palestine the conditions that had led to the emergence of anti-Semitism. This is from the Histadrut. Thus, the ideology and practices that underline the process of colonization, with the escalation of the conflict with the Arab society in Palestine, were developing fascist characteristics in Zionist organizations. This is now back to Kanafani. fascist Zionism was using the same, this is not a new term, this is a term that's been used for a long time. Because Zionism in its approach towards the Palestinians is not very different to the Nazis' approach to the Jews in Germany and in Europe in the Second World War. That's why they call it Zionist fascism. Or fascist Zionism. He says fascist Zionism was using the same tools as the mounting fascism in Europe. The Arab worker was at the bottom of a complex social pyramid, and his condition grew worse as a result of the confusion within the Arab labor movement. During the period between the early 20s and early 30s, the progressive labor movement, Arab as well as Jewish, suffered crushing blows, which together with the impact of purely subjective weaknesses, resulted in its virtual paralysis. On the one hand, the Zionist movement, which was rapidly becoming fascist in character and resorted to armed terrorism, sought to isolate and destroy the Communist Party, most of whose leaders were Jews, and that resisted being contained by Zionist labor organizations. On the other hand, the Palestinian feudal religious leadership could not tolerate the rise of an Arab labor movement that was independent of its control. So here he's citing basically internal divisions amongst the Zionists themselves, between the so-called communist left and what he's talking about as the fascist right, and even amongst the Arabs there was division, there was dissension, there was disunity. The movement was thus terrorized by the Arab leadership in the early 30s, and also bear in mind, Kanafani, speaking of Kanafani, who eventually joined a particular Palestinian liberation movement. I'm just looking for it here. And he was, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And he was very much involved in the shaping of its Marxist-Leninist ideology. So we, in terms of ideology, we need to understand this because of the fact that when he speaks, he's speaking from that perspective and that point of view. So let's go back to Kanafani. The main reason why we are reading Kanafani was he was an eyewitness to the Nakba of 48. Although he was only born in 36, but he's an eyewitness to the Nakba of 48. And he did a lot of research in terms of the main causes to the outbreak of the Arab revolt against the British administration. So there is definitely a lot of benefit in terms of understanding the economic strain, the marginalization, the discrimination that was put on the Palestinian Arabs that basically led to the outbreak of the revolt in 1936. So he says here the movement was thus terrorized by the Arab leadership. In the early 30s, the Mufti's group assassinated Michael Mitri, president of the Federation of Arab Workers in Jaffa. Years later, Sami Taha, a trade unionist and president of the Federation of Arab Workers in Haifa, was also assassinated. Okay, I mean, again, this is from his perspective. His perspective as a Marxist-Leninist, as somebody that was a trade unionist. So at the end of the day, Allahu Alam as to exactly what happened. But it's important for us to understand and to talk about the fact that there was dissension, there was disunity amongst the Arabs. And whenever there's dissension and disunity, there's weakness. And although there was, especially during the revolt, they were rallying around a common, a qasim mushtarak, one could call it, a common goal or common ideology, which was Palestinian nationalism. Which from an Islamic point of view, we can say nationalism was the reason why we lost Palestine in the first place. وأن هذه أمتكم أمة واحدة وأنا ربكم فاعبدون. and know that this ummah of yours is one ummah. There's not ummah Arabiya or ummah Turkiya or ummah Palestiniya, ummah Masriya. There's not a Palestinian ummah and an Egyptian ummah and a Turkish ummah and an Arab ummah and a black ummah and a white ummah. No, ummatan wahida. Wa ana rabbukum fa'budun. And I am your Lord, so worship me, says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, but from the perspective of a Palestinian who was a Marxist-Leninist, this is, he is here accusing the Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, that the Mufti's group, whether it was from his command or not from his command, he's not saying here, but he's saying that there were several individuals within the Arab Federation or Federation of Arab Workers in the so-called Arab proletariat working class that were assassinated because of this power struggle within the Arab movement, within the nationalist movement. In the absence of an economically and politically strong national bourgeoisie, the workers were directly confronted and oppressed by the traditional feudal leadership. Again, that is his opinion, his perspective, and we take it with a pinch of salt. The conflict occasionally led to violent confrontations, which were reduced whenever the traditional leadership managed to assume direct control over trade union activities. As a result, labor activity lost its essential role in the struggle. Moreover, it was with the sharpening of the national struggle, a relative identity of interest united the workers with the traditional Arab leadership. On one occasion, a group of demonstrating communists clashed with a Zionist demonstration in Tel Aviv and were forced to flee the city and take refuge in the Arab quarter of Manshi and Jaffa. Later, a confrontation took place with the British security force that was sent to arrest the Bolsheviks. In a statement distributed the same day, the executive committee of the party declared, "The Jewish workers are here to live with you. They have not come to persecute you, but to live with you. They are ready to fight on your side against the capitalist enemy." So here we have this division amongst the Arabs and even amongst the Zionists. And the so-called communists or socialists from the Arabs and communists and socialists from the Zionists, there was this almost like attempt of the Zionists to allay the fears of the workers, the Arab workers, that they are not against them. But the reality of the situation, that Zionism was going to bring about the total devastation of the Palestinian Arabs, whether they were communists, socialists, so-called Islamists, nationalists, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the Zionist project was about, like Jabotinsky said, let the American Jews pay $500 million and let us transfer the Palestinians to Iraq and to Saudi Arabia. What did Israel Zangwill say? The Arabs must trek. What did David Ben Gurion say? The Arabs will have no other choice but to flee. What did Theodore Herzl say? He said, "We shall spirit the penniless poor across the border." So it doesn't matter whether they were socialist Zionists, communist Zionists, whether they were labor Zionists, whether they were general Zionists, whether they were so-called liberal democratic Zionists, whether they were cultural Zionists. At the end of the day, Zionism was going to bring about a total destruction for the Palestinian Arab society in Palestine, and ending up, as we see right now, with a genocide in Gaza, and now perhaps, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, we seek refuge in Allah, samah Allah, is the same thing going to be reproduced in the West Bank. We surrender our matter to Allah. وَيَمْكُرُ وَيَمْكُرُ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ. And they plot and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. With that, we end our halaqah, and I leave you all in the protection of Allah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.